Have you ever been told without a single word that you didn't belong somewhere, that your presence alone was a mistake? Imagine being a 14-year-old girl, boarding a plane with a first-class ticket in hand, and being told to step aside. Not because of your ticket, not because of a rule, but because of how you look. Now imagine the silence that follows the stares, the shame, the choice you have to make. Do you fight back and risk being labeled angry, or do you stay still, knowing your calm might speak louder than their doubt? That morning, a young black girl named Amara Lewis chose silence not out of fear, but strength. 10 minutes later, her father, David Lewis, a quiet powerhouse and CEO, walked into that terminal and changed the meaning of justice mid-flight. But this isn't just their story. It's about every moment you've been underestimated, every time you've had to prove your worth just to exist. If it were you, what would you do? Stay with us as we unfold the story that grounded a flight and lifted a conversation the world needed to hear. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because this story deserves to fly farther. The gate was already crowded when Amara Lewis reached the front of the line. Denver International always smelled faintly like coffee and metal, that strange mix of travel and waiting. She adjusted the strap of her canvas backpack and held her boarding pass tight between her fingers. It said, Site 2C First Class Delta, Western Flight 2017 to Seattle. Her father had booked it for her the night before. He'd smiled when he handed it to her, saying, Travel smart, stay calm, and remember your presence belongs anywhere your ticket says it does. She'd laughed then, not realizing how much those words would matter. When she reached the boarding door, the flight attendant looked up, a woman in her early 40s, perfectly pressed navy blazer, hair pulled into a sharp bun that tugged at the corners of her face. Her name tag read Carol Mason. Carol smiled in that way that wasn't really a smile, more like politeness stretched too tight. Sweetheart, she said. Her tone clipped. First class is for confirmed passengers. You might be in the wrong line. The words hit harder than Amara expected, not because of what they meant, but because of how easily they came out, as if this woman had already decided who she was, just by looking at her. Amara blinked once, then twice. Her heart thudded softly in her chest. She lifted the ticket. It's confirmed, she said, voice steady. I'm Amara Lewis, seat 2C. Carol didn't look at the ticket. She looked at Amara, up and down. Then she gave a little exhale, the kind that sounds like disbelief wrapped in courtesy. Let's not hold up the line. Okay, just step aside, and I'll check with the gate. A man behind Amara, maybe mid-50s, muttered. She probably printed it wrong. His wife didn't say anything she didn't have to. Her silence did the talking. For a second, the noise of the terminal faded. The PA announcements, the rolling of luggage, even the baby crying 2 gates over it all blurred into a low hum. Amara felt her throat tighten, but she swallowed hard and forced herself to breathe slowly. She'd been taught this. Her father called it the power of stillness. When the world tries to make you small, stand taller, if only inside. So she stepped aside, as politely as she could, and waited near the jet bridge wall. Carol turned away, talking into her radio, voice brisk. Possible seat discrepancy in first class? Passenger name Lewis? No. She doesn't appear on our usual list profile. That last word profile hung in the air like smoke. People were boarding now. A line of business travelers in gray suits and wireless earbuds. A woman in yoga pants with a designer duffel. A teenage boy wearing a varsity jacket, laughing into his phone. Each one handed over their ticket, smiled, and walked past. No questions, no pauses. Amara stayed where she was, clutching the strap of her bag until her fingers ached. She tried not to look at the stairs. Some were curious, some were cautious. Some just looked through her, like she wasn't even there. Finally, she whispered to herself, "You did everything right." But right didn't seem to matter much. Carol came back, holding a small clipboard like a badge of authority. "Okay," she said, her tone sharp but rehearsed. "Your ticket looks odd. I'll need to verify this with operations." Amara nodded once, quiet, respectful. She handed the ticket over with both hands the way her dad always did when giving something important. Carol took it, barely looking, then stepped into the jet bridge and disappeared. The seconds stretched, then a minute, then 2. Passengers kept boarding. Gate agents smiled, called group numbers, checked IDs. Life went on except for Amara, who was still standing there like time had forgotten her. She could feel it, the eyes, the unspoken judgment. Maybe they thought she was trying to sneak in. Maybe they thought a girl like her couldn't belong up front. It wasn't new, but it still hurt. Her throat burned, her chest tightened. And deep down, a little voice whispered the question she hated most. What did I do wrong this time? She closed her eyes, took a slow breath, and reached for her phone. Her father always answered on the first ring. He did this thing when she was little. He'd say, "I can't stop the world from being unfair, kid, but I can make sure you never face it alone." The line clicked. "Hey, princess," came his voice, warm, low, calm. "Dad," she whispered, "it's happening again." There was silence for half a heartbeat. "What's going on?" he asked. "They won't let me board," she said. "They said they have to verify my ticket. I showed it. It's valid. But Her voice broke slightly. "She looked at me like I wasn't supposed to be there." Another pause. Not confusion calculation. "Where are you?" he asked. "Gate C-47, she said softly. "By the jet bridge. Everyone's watching." He exhaled. The sound controlled, measured. "Okay," he said finally. "Don't move. Don't argue. I'll be there in 5 minutes." Amara bit her lip. "Dad, you don't have to. I'm already on my way." Then, softer. "You did nothing wrong." The call ended. She lowered the phone and looked around. The gate agent, a young man named Aaron, gave her an apologetic half-smile from behind the counter, but said nothing. He'd scanned her ticket himself 15 minutes ago. It had beeped green. He knew she was cleared, but he also knew better than to challenge a lead attendant in front of passengers. The system was built that way. Amara glanced toward the plane. Through the jet bridge window, she could see the edge of the first-class cabin, wide seats, soft lights, a flight magazine already folded on a tray. Her seat 2C sat empty. She thought about walking back to the counter, demanding to be let in, but she stopped herself. That wasn't who she was, and it wasn't what her father had taught her. So she stood, quiet, present, visible. She pulled a small notebook from her backpack. It was leather-bound, the pages slightly bent at the corners. Her father had given it to her on her 12th birthday. On the first page he'd written, "Write when they make you question yourself. Truth doesn't fade when you keep it in ink." She turned to a blank page and wrote carefully, "They took my seat, but they can't take my place." Her handwriting trembled, but the line stayed straight. Behind her, someone cleared their throat. It was an older woman, gray hair, soft scarf, gentle eyes. "Sweetheart," she said quietly, "I saw what happened. You hold that chin high." "Okay." Amara nodded, her throat too tight for words. The woman smiled, then boarded. The curtain swished shut behind her, and for a moment, that thin strip of fabric felt like a wall 20 feet high. From the intercom, Carol's voice returned, polite and clipped. Final boarding for Group 1, Flight 217 to Seattle. The line thinned. The jet bridge door began to close. Amara still stood there, silent, notebook in hand. Carol emerged again, her tone still professional. "Sorry, honey. Still waiting on ops to confirm your reservation." Amara looked at her boarding pass still in Carol's hand. Her name, her flight number, her seat, everything printed clearly. And yet it wasn't enough. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything. But instead, she remembered her father's words from years ago, spoken one night after they'd been followed by a store clerk for no reason. Sometimes the loudest truth is quiet. The moment you stop shrinking, they start seeing. So she didn't shrink. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stood taller than before. Her reflection in the glass door looked older, somehow steadier. In the background, she heard a passenger whisper, "Poor kid." Another said, "Maybe it's just a mix-up." And then, softer, from somewhere in the line, "This isn't right." That last voice belonged to a flight attendant, a younger one, standing near the beverage cart, brown hair pulled back loosely. Her badge read, "Lena Ortiz." She looked directly at Amara and gave the smallest nod, like a secret promise. It was enough. Amara tightened her grip on the notebook. She wrote one more line beneath the first. "They can question my ticket, but not my truth." The engines outside started to hum. Boarding was almost complete. And still, she waited, not crying, not pleading, just waiting, exactly where her father had told her to. 5 minutes, he'd said. Just 5. She didn't know what he would do when he got here, but she knew one thing for sure. He always kept his word. The gate clock read 8:42. 5 minutes later, that flight would no longer belong to Carol Mason, or Delta Western, or anyone else. It would belong to something bigger, to every quiet act of resistance that ever refused to disappear. The soft murmur of the terminal seemed louder now, as if the air itself had grown restless. Amara Lewis stood near the gate window, the metal frame cold beneath her fingers. Outside, a drizzle had begun, thin streaks of rain blurring the view of the runway lights. The storm was distant, but coming closer. The kind that didn't roar, it crept. The kind that felt like something waiting to happen. She could feel eyes still on her. People who had seen enough to be uncomfortable, but not enough to care. The boarding door stood half open, a sliver of light from the jet bridge slicing through the carpeted floor. Her ticket, her proof, was still in Carol Mason's hand. The woman had disappeared again, probably talking to someone over the radio, confirming whatever she already believed to be true. The digital clock above the gate flicked from 8:43 to 8:44. Amara exhaled slowly and tried to focus on her breathing. Her father had always said, "Breathe through the noise, not away from it." She imagined his voice now steady, deep, patient. At that very moment, David Lewis was walking briskly through Concourse C, phone pressed to his ear. His polished shoes made almost no sound on the tile. He'd left his laptop open on a coffee-stained table in the executive lounge. The words, "EtherTech Annual Ethics Review," glowing on the screen. He didn't need to read it again. He was about to live it. Control. "This is Lewis," he said into the phone. Calm but clipped. "Confirm the tail number for Flight 217. The voice on the other end hesitated. "Sir, is there an issue?" "Soon," he replied. "Just keep the channel open." He ended the call, straightened his jacket, and adjusted the small pin on his lapel, the EtherTech emblem, silver and blue, shaped like a pair of wings. People often noticed it before they noticed him. That was fine. It made them underestimate what came next. Back at the gate, Amara's fingers trembled, but her face didn't show it. A toddler laughed somewhere behind her, kicking his legs in a stroller, and the sound oddly grounded her. She smiled, just for a second. Life kept moving, even when yours stopped. Then the jet bridge door opened, and Carol returned. Her expression was composed, the kind of calm that hides discomfort. "Okay, Miss Lewis," she said, using the title like a thin disguise of respect. "Operations hasn't confirmed your seat yet." "You'll need to wait off to the side," Amara asked quietly. "Did something happen to my ticket?" Carol looked at her clipboard. "It's irregular. The upgrade seems unusual. Are you traveling alone?" "Yes, ma'am." "Where are your parents?" "My father is nearby," Amara said. Carol's brows lifted, like she hadn't expected that answer. "Well, until he arrives. Please don't block the boarding area." The words were polite. The meaning wasn't. Lena Ortiz watched from across the aisle. She'd been arranging cups behind the galley curtain, but her hands had stilled. Something about the whole thing gnawed at her. She'd seen plenty of seat mix-ups, but never handled like this. There was no reason to hold that girl. The system had scanned her green. Lena had watched it happen. She stepped closer to the doorway. "Carol," she said softly, "we're nearly closed out." "Are you sure Ops requested another verification?" Carol didn't meet her eyes. "Just following protocol." Lena hesitated. She wanted to argue, but she'd seen what happened to attendants who questioned a lead in front of passengers. It always ended the same way, with a warning slip and an empty schedule. So she said nothing, just clenched her jaw and watched Amara standing there, small but unshaken. At 8:46, David Lewis reached the security checkpoint. He walked with purpose, not speed. He didn't need to run to make people move. His phone buzzed his assistant, Marcus. Texting, "Everything okay, sir?" He typed back, "Not yet. Keep legal on standby." As he approached gate C-47, he saw his daughter before she saw him. Her posture stopped him cold straight, quiet, unyielding. She wasn't crying. She wasn't hiding. She was simply waiting, as if she knew he would come. For a moment, he didn't move. He wanted to remember this, how she carried her dignity like armor. Then he stepped forward. Carol noticed him first. She smiled automatically, the way staff do when someone in a tailored suit approaches. "Sir, we'll be boarding in just a moment." He didn't slow down. "My name is David Lewis," he said evenly. "My daughter has been standing here for 10 minutes because you refused her entry. Would you like to explain why?" Carol blinked. "Sir, I was only—" He held up a hand, calm but final. "Before you answer, know that I design half of the avionics systems keeping this aircraft in the sky. So if you're about to say this is a security issue, choose your words carefully." The surrounding crowd went silent. Even the gate announcements seemed to pause. Carol's lips parted, but no sound came. Then she glanced at Lena, as if seeking confirmation. Lena looked straight back and said clearly, her ticket scanned valid. "Mr. Lewis, I saw it myself." The truth landed like a stone dropped into water ripples of whispers spreading through the passengers nearby. David turned to Amara. "You okay?" She nodded once. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "They said I didn't look like I belonged in first class." He inhaled slowly, his face unreadable. "I see." He turned back to Carol, tone still measured. "When a system fails, we find the fault. In this case, the fault isn't technical. It's human. The gate agent Aaron stepped forward nervously. Sir, please, we can resolve this quietly. David looked at him, then at Carol. Quiet is how this keeps happening. Then he tapped his earpiece. Control! Hold Delta Western Flight 217 on the ground. Temporary compliance check. Aaron froze. Sir, you can't. I just did. The intercom crackled softly as if the plane itself hesitated. Over the radio came a pilot's voice. Cautious. This is Captain Carter. We've received a hold signal from EtherTech Systems. Is there a problem, Mr. Lewis? David answered calmly. There will be if we take off before acknowledging who belongs on your aircraft. Carol's face flushed. Mr. Lewis, this isn't necessary. He cut her off, not unkindly. It is when courtesy turns into cruelty. No one moved. No one spoke. The power in his restraint was louder than any shouting could have been. Amara felt something inside her chest loosen, like she could breathe again. Her father wasn't yelling, wasn't towering over anyone. He simply existed as if truth gave him gravity. Lena finally broke the silence. Sir, would you like your daughter seated now? He nodded. Please. Carol started to protest, but Captain Carter's voice came again through the radio. Confirmed hold. We'll delay until further notice. Passengers murmured. Some pulled out phones, filming quietly. The story was already spreading. David turned back to Carol. You'll file a report, of course. Just make sure you include how you determined she didn't fit the profile. I'll request a copy. She said nothing. He exhaled softly, the tension leaving his shoulders. You can release the boarding now, but this flight isn't leaving until it's made right. He looked down at Amara. Go on. Take your seat. She hesitated, then stepped past Carol. The curtain between economy and first class brushed her shoulder as she entered. The air inside smelled faintly of citrus and new leather. Every eye in the cabin followed her. She placed her bag beneath the seat and sat down. The window beside her reflected her face still, composed. Outside, rain had started to fall harder, streaking the glass. In the aisle. Lena knelt slightly, setting a glass of water on Amara's tray. You handled that like a professional, she whispered. Amara smiled faintly. I just stood still. Lena nodded, eyes bright. Sometimes that's the hardest thing. As David turned to leave, Aaron approached cautiously. Mr. Lewis, the captain wants confirmation to lift the hold once your daughter's settled. David paused, meeting his eyes. She's settled. The question is, are you? Aaron looked down, ashamed. Yes, sir. David gave a single nod, then stepped aside, letting the boarding complete. He didn't sit in first class. Instead, he walked to row 15 and took an empty seat in economy. The other passengers glanced at him, whispering, but he didn't care. He wanted his daughter to see that dignity wasn't about where you sat. It was about how you stood. When the plane finally pushed back from the gate, the rain outside had become a steady curtain. Amara looked out through it, the lights of the terminal blurring into gold and silver streaks. Somewhere below the clouds, justice had taken a small, quiet breath. The engines hummed low, a steady vibration under Amara's feet. The plane had pulled back from the gate, but still sat motionless, waiting for clearance that never came. The sky outside was gray now, rain washing across the window like a restless heartbeat. Inside the cabin, whispers flowed in small, nervous waves. Amara stared ahead, pretending to read the safety card tucked into the seat pocket. Her fingers traced the smooth paper without seeing it. Around her, People shifted, checking watches, sighing softly. First class was usually a space of quiet luxury, but now it felt charged, like everyone was breathing the same unsettled air. Lena Ortiz moved silently down the aisle, collecting stray cups, but her eyes flicked often toward the front where Carol Mason stood rigid, murmuring into her radio. Lena's stomach twisted. She knew this wasn't over. David Lewis sat 3 rows back in economy, posture straight, hands clasped loosely on his knee. From here, he could see part of his daughter's profile through the curtain gap. She was looking out the window again, still as stone. It broke his heart and steadied it at the same time. He had spent years teaching his employees that composure was strength. He never imagined he'd be teaching his child the same lesson at 30,000 feet. A chime sounded. The intercom crackled. Captain Ellen Carter's voice came, calm but tight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief hold before departure. We appreciate your patience." Her words sounded neutral, but David caught the controlled tension beneath them. He had spoken with enough pilots in his life to recognize when calm was just camouflage. Carol Mason turned, her face pale but composed. She glanced at Lena and whispered, "They're still checking that compliance alert. EtherTech flagged it manually." Lena frowned. Why would they do that? Carol hesitated. Because her father works there. Lena's eyebrows rose. "You mean Mr. Lewis?" Carol nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Apparently. He has authority over our aircraft systems. That's why the flight's frozen." Lena's stomach dropped. She realized what had just happened. He hadn't raised his voice. He'd raised the stakes. The tension spread quietly through the cabin. Passengers pulled out phones, searching for signal, whispering theories. Some were annoyed. Others were curious. But a few, especially the older woman from earlier, Martha Wells, watched Amara with a kind of quiet admiration. She leaned toward the businessman beside her and whispered, "That child is teaching us all how to stand tall without shouting." Amara felt eyes on her, but didn't turn. She closed her notebook and slid it gently into her backpack. Inside, she could still feel her pulse thudding through her fingertips. She wanted to believe everything was fine now, but something told her the storm wasn't done. Up front, Carol's headset crackled again. "Ops control. We have confirmation that the hold came directly from EtherTech Systems, authorized by David Lewis. Do we have clearance to continue boarding protocols?" The reply was crisp. "Negative. Maintain position until internal review concludes." Carol swallowed. Her mouth felt dry. Around her, the first-class passengers were beginning to grow restless. A man in a pinstripe suit muttered, "If this is about that girl, it's ridiculous." "We've got connections to make," another passenger added. "You know how sensitive everything is these days. People play the race card, and suddenly the world stops turning." The words stung Amara, even though they weren't directed at her. She stared down at her hands, willing herself not to cry. Lena heard it too. She stopped near the galley, her voice quiet but clear. "Sir, this isn't about a card. It's about courtesy." The man looked startled, but said nothing more. David caught the exchange from his seat. His jaw tightened, but he didn't interfere. He wanted the truth to unfold without force. He wanted them to see themselves. He took out his phone and opened the internal system app. With a few taps, he accessed the aircraft's compliance log. The incident number flashed on screen: 217 C-47 bias hold. He exhaled slowly, almost sadly. The system he'd designed to flag ethical misconduct in aviation had just caught his own daughter's humiliation. At that moment, Captain Carter emerged from the cockpit. Tall, confident, composed, she approached Carol and asked quietly, "May I have a word?" They stepped aside into the galley. Lena pretended to rearrange napkins nearby, but she listened. Carter's voice was low. "We can't lift off until this is cleared." EtherTech triggered the hold under human conduct review. "That's not routine." Carol's tone sharpened. "Captain, I followed procedure. You followed assumption?" Carter replied. "An assumption's about to cost us time, fuel, and reputation." Carol bristled. "Are you implying Carter cut in, steady and firm?" "I'm implying that your passenger list isn't the problem. Your perception is." There was silence. The hum of the engines filled it. Carter straightened, smoothing her jacket. "We'll wait for official clearance. In the meantime, I suggest you apologize to the young lady before the cameras do it for you." Carol turned to glance down the aisle. A few phones were already angled toward her, subtle but obvious. A bead of sweat rolled behind her ear. Lena stepped back into view, catching her eye. The younger attendant didn't speak, but her expression said everything. "Do the right thing." Carol hesitated, then began walking slowly toward Amara. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last. When she stopped beside 2C, Amara looked up, her dark eyes calm and unreadable. Carol cleared her throat. "Miss Lewis, there appears to have been a misunderstanding regarding your seat. I want to apologize for the inconvenience." Her words were practiced, stiff, but they reached Amara all the same. The girl nodded politely. "Thank you," she said simply. But then she added, softly enough that only Carol and Lena could hear inconvenience fades, "Dignity doesn't—" For the first time, Carol didn't know how to respond. She straightened abruptly and turned away. The intercom clicked again. "Attention, crew," Captain Carter announced. "Hold has been extended for final documentation. We appreciate your patience." Lena exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. She leaned toward Amara and whispered, "That line, you should write that one down." Amara smiled faintly. "Already did, in economy." David looked out the window as the rain slowed to a drizzle. He could see the reflection of his daughter's face in the glass. The same calm, the same quiet resolve. A sense of pride swelled in him, mixed with sorrow that she'd had to learn strength this way. He closed his eyes briefly and murmured a silent promise. She won't fight this battle alone again. Minutes later, his phone buzzed. It was an internal message from EtherTech Compliance Incident. Logged, action pending, crew report required within 48 hours. He typed one word in reply received. Then he pocketed the phone and looked ahead, letting the hum of the cabin fade into a low rhythm. The storm outside had weakened, but inside, something far more powerful was building a reckoning quiet enough to be heard. Lena moved through the aisle again, offering water, smiling faintly at passengers who avoided her eyes. She paused by Carol, who was staring out at the tarmac. "You did what you thought was right," Lena said gently. "But sometimes right just means familiar." Carol didn't answer. She looked down at her reflection in the cabin window, the outline of her own face blurred by rain. At 9:17, Captain Carter's voice returned. "Control confirms compliance cleared. Prepare for taxi." Relief rippled through the cabin, but it wasn't the triumphant kind. It was weary, uncertain. People wanted to move on. Only Amara and her father understood that moving on didn't mean it was over. As the plane rolled slowly down the runway, David reached for the seatbelt buckle and whispered under his breath, "Justice doesn't rush. In first class." Amara stared at the clouds, her notebook open again on her lap. On the page, she wrote, Sometimes the sky holds its breath until truth can breathe again. Her pen paused. She looked up, catching her own reflection. Then she smiled, not wide, not proud, but peaceful. The engines roared softly as the aircraft lifted, carving through the last thin layer of gray. Sunlight spilled across the wing, golden and forgiving. Amara watched the light and thought, maybe this was what healing looked like, not forgetting, not winning, just finally being seen. And as the ground fell away beneath them, for the first time that morning, she felt weightless. The cabin settled into an uneasy calm. The engines hummed as the plane sliced through a thin layer of clouds, the kind that turned sunlight into soft gold. Passengers reclined their seats, opened laptops, and pretended that the morning's tension had never happened. But the air carried something heavier than altitude, the residue of shame, of realization, of something seen and not forgotten. Amara sat quietly in seat 2C, her notebook open on the tray table. She wasn't writing now. She was listening to the way silence changed shape, how it wasn't emptiness, but something alive. Sometimes silence felt like a bruise. Sometimes it felt like peace. Today, it was both. Lena Ortiz moved softly through the aisle, her shoes making almost no sound on the carpet. When she passed Amara, she paused for a heartbeat, whispering, "You doing okay?" Amara nodded. "I think so." Lena smiled. "Just a small one. That's a strong answer." She straightened and continued her rounds. Across the curtain, David Lewis watched his daughter from row 15. She looked calm, but he knew that kind of calm, the kind that comes from exhaustion, not ease. He'd worn it himself, in boardrooms where he'd been questioned for being in a seat he'd earned 10 times over. The way she held herself reminded him of those days, the quiet defiance that never made the news, but changed the room anyway. He thought about his wife, gone 7 years now. She had been the first to teach Amara that grace wasn't submission. You can be kind without shrinking, she used to say. That's how you win. The intercom clicked softly. Captain Ellen Carter's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached 34,000 feet. We'll be cruising for the next hour and 50 minutes. Weather ahead looks smooth." There was a pause, longer than usual. And then, "We'd also like to thank our passengers for their patience earlier. We're committed to ensuring everyone feels respected and safe aboard this flight." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was something. A public acknowledgement, quiet, professional, but deliberate. David lifted his head slightly. It was a small step, but a meaningful one. Amara heard it too. She didn't smile, but her shoulders relaxed. She looked down at her notebook and finally began to write again. The words came slowly. When truth is quiet, it lasts longer. A few rows behind her, Martha Wells folded her newspaper and turned to her seatmate, the man who had complained earlier about delays. "You ever notice," she said softly, "how the people who stay quiet are the ones teaching the rest of us?" He didn't respond. He looked out the window, jaw tight, but something in his eyes had changed. Carol Mason sat in the galley, head bowed slightly, hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee gone cold. She'd spent 15 years in the sky, dealing with every kind of passenger imaginable, the rude, the grateful, the impossible. But never had she been held still like this, forced to look at herself through someone else's eyes. The rhythm of her breathing was uneven. She thought about the moment she doubted that girl's ticket, how instinct had felt like certainty. Now, it just felt hollow. Lena slid into the jump seat across from her. For a while, neither spoke. The sound of the engines filled the space between them. "Finally," Lena said. "You know, when I was a kid, my mom used to tell me that apologies aren't about guilt. They're about respect. You don't have to mean you were evil, just that you see where you went blind." Carol didn't look up. "You think she'd want to hear it?" Lena's gaze softened. "I think she already knows it. In first class." Amara reached into her backpack and pulled out her phone. She typed a message but didn't send it. "Landed yet?" "Nope, but I'm okay." She stared at it for a while, then deleted it. Some things were better said in person. David watched the light flicker across the seatbelt sign. He had always believed in systems and logic, in procedure, in fixing broken mechanisms. But this wasn't about wires or code. It was about the small, invisible permissions people give themselves to judge who belongs. He couldn't fix that with technology alone. He reached for his briefcase under the seat and took out a thin folder, EtherTech Ethics Reform. Tuki 25. Draft. He opened it, flipped past the charts and graphs, and began to write something new on the back page. Every bias begins as a comfort. Every comfort hides a cost. He paused, staring at the line, then circled it twice. Maybe this incident would just end in apologies. Maybe it could become something larger, a policy, a standard, a reminder written into the code of how people worked. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers began to stretch, stand, move quietly down the aisle. A baby giggled. The moment of tension dissolved, replaced by the ordinary hum of travel, but the morning still lingered in the edges of everyone's thoughts. Amara leaned her head against the window. Outside, the clouds looked like endless fields of white cotton, soft and endless. She remembered something her father once said when she was little and afraid of flying. "The sky only looks endless when you forget you're moving." She smiled faintly, closing her eyes. Maybe this was movement too, not forward through air, but upward through understanding. Carol finally stood. She smoothed her uniform, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward first class. Lena followed a few steps behind, watching her carefully, as if ready to step in if things went wrong. When Carol stopped beside Amara's seat, the girl looked up. There was no fear in her eyes, just quiet curiosity. Carol took a slow breath. "Miss Lewis," she began, her voice lower than before. "I owe you something more than what I said earlier." Amara didn't speak. "I made a judgment I had no right to make." Carol continued, "You deserved better, and I'll make sure this doesn't happen again, not just to you, but to anyone." For a long second, neither moved. Then Amara nodded. "Thank you." Carol's throat tightened. She wanted to say more, but words failed her. "Instead," she said softly, "you remind me of someone I used to be proud to know. I think she'd be proud of you, too." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Lena to blink back a tear she hadn't expected. In economy, David saw the exchange. He closed his folder and sat back, eyes on the ceiling. For the first time since the gate, his chest loosened. He thought of how change begins, not with shouting, not with punishment, but with a pause. The same kind of pause his daughter had stood in, holding herself steady while the world tried to make her disappear. Half an hour later, as lunch trays rolled down the aisle, Lena stopped by his row. "Mr. Lewis," she said quietly, "your daughter's remarkable." He smiled slightly. "She reminds me of her mother." Lena hesitated. "The captain asked if you'd like to debrief after landing. They're filing a report, but she wants your statement first." He nodded. "Tell her I will, and tell her, thank you for seeing it." Lena's eyes softened. You both made it hard not to. As she walked away, David looked back toward the front cabin. The curtain fluttered slightly, a thin line of light showing through the seam. For the first time all morning, that divide didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a bridge. Amara turned another page in her notebook and wrote, "Sometimes people don't change because they're bad. They change because they finally look long enough to see what good costs." She underlined the words twice, then closed the notebook. Outside, the clouds broke open, revealing a bright stretch of blue. The sunlight poured in through her window, warm against her skin. She reached for her water, took a sip, and leaned back with a slow breath. She wasn't sure what her father would say when they landed, but she knew what she'd tell him first. You were right. Calm isn't silence, it's power. The plane glided smoothly across the sky, carrying a cabin full of people who would never look at a boarding pass the same way again. The hum of the engines had softened into something like a lullaby. The passengers seemed to have settled at last, though an invisible current still moved quietly through the cabin, the kind of energy that comes when people have witnessed something they don't know how to name. In first class. Amara stared out the window again. The clouds below looked endless, like a slow ocean made of light. She traced small circles on the glass with her fingertip, thinking about how still the sky looked when you were high enough not to feel its turbulence. She wasn't angry anymore, not in the way she had been at the gate. What she felt now was something gentler, stranger almost pity, not for herself, but for people like Carol Mason, who lived their lives sure of things that were never true. Lena Ortiz approached quietly, carrying a tray with a cup of hot chocolate. "Thought you might want this," she said. Amara smiled. "Thank you." "It's the last packet," Lena added, lowering her voice. "Don't tell the captain." Amara laughed softly, the first real laugh she'd let out since the flight began. Lena felt the heaviness around them lift just a little. "Do you fly a lot?" Lena asked, leaning against the armrest. "Sometimes," Amara said. "My dad travels for work. I go with him when I can." Lena nodded. "That must be exciting?" "It used to be," Amara said after a pause. "Now it just feels complicated." Lena understood more than she said. She wanted to tell Amara that being seen as a question before being seen as a person was something she knew too, but she stayed quiet. Sometimes the best comfort was just standing close enough that someone knew they weren't alone. A chime sounded overhead. The voice of Captain Ellen Carter came again, calm and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent into Seattle shortly. Cabin crew, please prepare for landing." David Lewis closed the file on his lap. He had been writing nonstop for the last 40 minutes, filling the margins with thoughts that weren't for reports or committees. They were for him to remember what it felt like to be powerless in a place where he usually held control. The truth of that contradiction sat heavy in his chest. He looked toward the curtain that separated him from his daughter and thought of the moment she'd said, "They said I didn't look like I belonged in first class." That sentence had carved its way into him, not just as a father, but as a man who had built his life around fairness, only to realize fairness didn't travel as fast as money or titles. Martha Wells leaned slightly toward him from across the aisle. "She's a brave one," she said softly. He nodded. "She's her mother's child." "I figured," Martha said, smiling. "You've got that same quiet edge in your eyes, the kind that doesn't shout it, just stays." David smiled faintly. "She stayed when I couldn't." Martha didn't ask what he meant. She just nodded, understanding that some sentences aren't meant to end in the galley. Carol Mason stood by the service door, staring out the small circular window. The clouds had thinned, revealing the faint outline of mountains below. She felt small against their shape, the way people always do when they realize how large the world is compared to their mistakes. Lena joined her quietly. "You okay?" Carol hesitated. "I thought I was, but now I just feel exposed." Lena tilted her head. "That's not always bad." Carol's voice dropped. "You ever realize you've spent years thinking you were fair until the moment you're not?" Lena looked down. "Yes," she said softly, "but realizing it means you're already changing." Carol didn't respond, but she smiled a thin, uncertain smile that still carried something like gratitude. When the plane began its descent, the world outside turned from gold to blue, then blue to gray. Raindrops streaked across the window again, chasing each other down the glass like quiet memories. Amara felt her stomach dip slightly with the angle of the plane, but she didn't look away. There was something grounding about watching the city come closer, skyscrapers emerging from clouds, streets winding like veins of light. She thought of all the people who would walk those streets today, unaware that somewhere above them, a small act of courage had bent something invisible toward justice. As the plane leveled, the intercom chimed again. "Cabin crew, seats for landing." David closed his folder and buckled his seatbelt. His reflection in the window looked older somehow. Not from years, but from the weight of seeing the world more clearly. He thought of what would happen next. The reports, the emails, the statements from the airline. He knew how companies worked. They would apologize, announce new training programs, maybe post a press release about inclusivity. But that wasn't enough. Not this time. This time, he wanted something real. The tires touched the runway with a soft thud. A ripple of applause broke from a few passengers, as it sometimes does when people mistake arrival for relief. The plane slowed, engines roaring, then eased into silence as it taxied toward the gate. Amara exhaled slowly, unbuckling her seatbelt. Her hands were steady now. When the seatbelt sign clicked off, Lena stepped forward. "Miss Lewis," she said quietly, "the captain would like to see you and your father before deplaning." Amara nodded. "Of course." She gathered her notebook and backpack. As she stood, several passengers nearby offered her small, encouraging smiles. Nothing loud or theatrical, just quiet acknowledgement. She met each one with a nod. In economy. David rose from his seat. As he moved down the aisle, people stepped aside. He wasn't dressed like someone powerful, no tie, no badge, just a plain jacket. But presence doesn't need permission. He reached the front where Captain Carter waited, composed and dignified. Carol stood beside her, hands clasped. Lena hovered a step back. "Mr. Lewis," Carter said, extending her hand. "We'd like to speak privately, if you have a moment." He shook her hand. "Of course." Carter's gaze flicked to Amara. "And Miss Lewis." "If you're comfortable joining us," Amara nodded. They stepped aside near the cockpit, where the hum of the engines was softer. Carter took a breath. "Mr. Lewis, I want to formally apologize for what happened before departure. It was unacceptable. I've already logged an incident report and contacted operations. Carol has submitted her statement as well." David studied her face, searching for sincerity. He found it. "I appreciate that," he said. "But my concern isn't just what happened to my daughter. It's what happens after." Carter nodded. "Understood. I'll make sure this doesn't disappear into paperwork." He glanced at Carol, who looked like she'd aged a few years since the morning. "Miss Mason," he said evenly. I trust you've learned something from this." She met his eyes, voice low. "I learned that sometimes the person who looks out of place is exactly where they belong. I'm sorry, sir. Truly." Amara stepped forward. "You don't have to call him sir," she said softly. "You can just mean it." The words landed gently, not as defiance, but as truth. Carol's eyes glistened. "Then I am sorry. Amara, you taught me more than I deserve to learn." Lena watched the exchange with quiet admiration. Captain Carter's voice softened. "We'll make sure this moment matters," she said. "The question is how David considered her for a long moment. By remembering, it doesn't end here," he said. "By treating every gate, every seat, every conversation as if someone's watching, because someone always is." The door opened with a metallic click. The cool air of the terminal swept in, carrying the sound of engines, voices, and distant announcements. Amara looked out at the people waiting beyond the glass, their faces blurred by the reflections of rain. Her father placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Ready?" She smiled faintly. "Yeah." They stepped off together, father and daughter, walking side by side through the jet bridge that still smelled faintly of fuel and morning rain. Behind them, Lena and Captain Carter exchanged a glance that said more than words. This was only the beginning. As they disappeared into the crowd, Carol exhaled deeply and whispered to herself, "Sometimes the air between words carries the loudest truth." And somewhere in the terminal, a small girl who had been told she didn't belong in first class had just rewritten the meaning of belonging altogether. Seattle rain had a rhythm of its own, soft, persistent, and strangely comforting. As the passengers filtered through the jet bridge, the sound of footsteps and murmured goodbyes mixed with the hiss of distant engines. Amara Lewis stepped into the terminal beside her father, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished floor. She could still feel the faint vibration of the plane under her feet, though it was only in her mind now. David slowed his pace, adjusting the strap of his briefcase. "You did well," he said softly. Amara smiled faintly. "I didn't do much." He looked down at her. "You did everything that mattered." They walked past the waiting crowd, families greeting loved ones, business travelers checking their watches. No one looking at them would know the weight of what had just happened, or that an entire flight had been paused because of one quiet act of prejudice. That was the strange thing about injustice. It didn't leave visible marks, but it stayed, invisible and unforgettable. As they approached baggage claim, a woman stepped out from near the escalators. She was in her early 40s, dark hair tied back neatly, a badge clipped to her blazer. The letters on it read, "Federal Aviation Oversight Ethics Division." "Mr. Lewis?" she asked, her voice calm but authoritative. He nodded. "Yes, my name is Dana Reeves," she said, extending her hand. "We received an internal compliance ping from EtherTech this morning regarding Flight 217. I'd like to debrief both you and your daughter privately, if you have time." David exchanged a glance with Amara. "Of course," he said. Dana led them through a side corridor to a small conference room overlooking the runway. The walls were glass, the kind of design meant to look open but still feel isolating. On the table sat 2 cups of coffee and a bottle of water. Someone had thought ahead. As they sat, Dana opened a thin black tablet. "I've reviewed the initial report from the captain and the crew logs. Before we finalize, I want to hear directly from you. Miss Lewis, if you're comfortable, could you tell me what happened from your perspective?" Amara hesitated, glancing at her father. He gave her a small nod. She began quietly. "I had a first-class ticket. I checked in. The gate agent scanned it. It was green. But when I went to board, the flight attendant said I was in the wrong line. She didn't even look at the ticket. She just told me to move. Dana didn't interrupt. Her pen moved in slow, careful strokes. Amara continued. When I showed her my seat number, she said she needed to verify. Then she kept letting everyone else board. It felt like she'd already decided I couldn't be there. Her voice trembled for the first time. People were staring. Nobody said anything. I didn't know what to do, so I called my dad. The room was quiet except for the sound of rain tapping against the glass. David's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. When she called, I was 5 gates away. By the time I arrived, 10 minutes had passed. Carol Mason. Your lead attendant was still holding my daughter's ticket and hadn't checked her system once. I asked for an explanation. She didn't have one. Dana nodded. And you issued a hold request through your company's compliance link. Yes, David said simply. I designed that system. It exists for a reason to flag ethical violations that compromise passenger dignity. Today, it worked. Dana looked at him thoughtfully. You understand this will trigger a review for both the airline and the flight crew. I'm not asking for punishment, he said. I'm asking for reflection. I want them to see what it looks like from this side, Amara added softly. I just want it not to happen again. Dana smiled faintly, though her eyes were serious. You'd be surprised how much change starts with that sentence. She closed her tablet and stood. We'll be in touch once the review's complete. For now, you're free to go. When they stepped back into the terminal, the air felt lighter, though the sky outside remained gray. David glanced at his watch. You hungry? Amara nodded, starving. They found a small cafe near the exit, the kind with wooden tables and a view of the runway. The barista recognized David people often did and offered a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. He noticed, but said nothing. Instead, he ordered 2 hot chocolates and a croissant. When they sat, Amara leaned her elbows on the table, tracing patterns in the condensation on her glass. Do you think she meant it? She asked quietly. Who, Carol? When she apologized? David thought about it. I think she's trying to. That's not the same as meaning it. He smiled gently. No, but it's how meaning begins. Amara tilted her head. You really believe people can change? He looked out the window at the runway lights flickering through rain. I have to, he said. Otherwise, I'm just teaching you to survive. Not to hope. She didn't respond, but she smiled a little. They ate in silence for a while. The cafe was nearly empty except for a couple near the window and a man in a pilot's uniform scrolling through his phone. The world, as always, had already moved on. But David wasn't finished. After they left the cafe, he made one more call to a board member at Delta Western, a man named Robert Ellis. They had known each other for years, back when David's company had first partnered with the airline on navigation software. Robert, David said, voice calm but firm, we need to talk about bias training and accountability protocols, not theoretical operational. I want a meeting next week. Ellis sighed on the other end. David, you know we're implementing diversity programs already. I'm not talking about posters in terminals. David interrupted. I'm talking about real, measurable reform, passenger verification processes, behavior metrics, live monitoring of discrimination reports, and I want EtherTech to help design them. Ellis was quiet for a long time. Then he said, You're serious. I'm always serious when my daughter bleeds for someone else's blindness, David said softly. That line landed like a weight. "I'll call you Monday," Ella said finally. David ended the call and slipped his phone into his pocket. He turned to Amara, who was watching him carefully. "You're starting something, aren't you?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm finishing something that should have started long ago." They walked toward the exit, the glass doors sliding open with a soft hiss. The rain had turned into mist, light and steady, wrapping the world in a kind of hush. Outside, a man held up a sign that read Lewis EtherTech Transport. As they approached, the driver, Marcus, David's assistant, opened the door. "Rough morning, boss?" he asked. David chuckled. "You could say that." Marcus turned to Amara. "You doing okay, kiddo?" She nodded. "Better than the people who underestimated me." Marcus laughed. "That's the spirit." As the car pulled away from the terminal, Amara rested her head against the window. The city blurred by streetlights glowing in puddles, people hurrying under umbrellas. Somewhere inside her, the ache of humiliation was giving way to something else resolve. Her father's reflection looked calm beside her, but she could tell his mind was already moving. Planning, building, reshaping. That was who he was, and she loved him for it. "Dad," she said softly. "Yes, can I help?" He turned toward her. "You already are." The rain drummed softly on the roof as they drove toward downtown. In the rearview mirror, the airport lights faded into the distance. Somewhere behind them, the system had started to change. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably. And in the back seat of a black sedan rolling through Seattle's gray afternoon, a 14-year-old girl looked out the window and whispered to herself, "I belong everywhere I stand." Her father heard her and smiled, but said nothing, because sometimes the echo after landing isn't the sound of engines, it's the sound of truth taking root. 2 weeks had passed since the flight, yet for David Lewis and his daughter Amara, the echoes of that morning had not quieted. The story had slipped beyond their control, carried by whispers, social media posts, and one short video taken by a passenger named Martha Wells. The video didn't show the confrontation itself. It showed Amara standing silently at the gate, her small notebook pressed to her chest, her face calm against the storm around her. The caption beneath it read, "Strength isn't always loud. It spread like wildfire." Within days, the clip had reached hundreds of thousands of viewers, shared across platforms under the hashtag #Seat2C. People began using it to talk about quiet resilience, about dignity, about the cost of being doubted. And while Amara didn't like the attention, she couldn't ignore what it had become, a mirror that reflected both pain and possibility. David sat in his office at EtherTech headquarters, a sleek glass building overlooking Elliott Bay. Rain streaked the windows as he reviewed an early draft of the joint reform proposal he and Delta Western were preparing. Across from him, his assistant Marcus scrolled through messages on a tablet. "Public response is still growing," Marcus said. "Airline's been trending for a week. They issued an apology this morning official video statement." David didn't look up. "And did they mean it?" Marcus smirked. "They looked like they practiced it for 2 days straight." David sighed, rubbing his temple. "Words are easy. Structure isn't. If they're serious, they'll put policy behind apology." He turned a page in his binder. "Where are we on the bias verification protocol draft? Legal's reviewing it now. You'll have feedback by tonight. They're calling it the Lewis Standard. By the way." David looked up, surprised. "That's not necessary. It wasn't your idea," Marcus said. "It was theirs." David leaned back, silent for a moment. He didn't want his name on a policy born of humiliation, but maybe that was the point. Sometimes change needed a scar to be seen. Across town. Amara sat at a small cafe near Pike Place Market, her notebook open beside a steaming cup of cocoa. She'd taken to writing after school every afternoon, filling page after page with thoughts she didn't say out loud. Today, the page read, "They said I didn't belong. But the truth is, they didn't know what belonging looks like." The bell over the door jingled, and a familiar voice called her name. It was Lena Ortiz, dressed casually in jeans and a navy coat, a far cry from her flight uniform. "Hey, you," Lena said, smiling as she slid into the seat across from her. "Hope I'm not interrupting your author moment." Amara grinned. "You found me. Your dad told me you like this place. Said it's where you think best." Amara laughed softly. "He's not wrong." Lena ordered tea, then leaned forward. "How are you holding up? I saw the video. You've basically become a symbol for patience and grace." "I didn't mean to," Amara said. "I know," Lena replied. "That's what makes it powerful." They sat quietly for a while, the sounds of espresso machines and chatter filling the background. Then Lena said, "I resigned from Delta Western." Amara blinked. "You did?" "Yeah. After the investigation, I realized I couldn't keep working in a place that fixes problems only after getting caught. I'm starting something new with Captain Carter. We're designing independent training programs for flight crews. Real ones, not just slideshows." Amara's eyes lit up. "That's amazing." "It's a start," Lena said. "Your dad's consulting for us, too. He said you might have a few words to say about the human side of algorithms." Amara tilted her head. "That sounds like something he'd say. It's also something you should say," Lena added. "You see things the rest of us miss." Amara looked out the window. The rain had stopped, leaving streaks of light across the glass. "Maybe," she said softly. "But sometimes I wish I could just be a kid again. Before all this." Lena's tone softened. "You still are. You just grew taller on the inside." Later that evening, as the city glowed beneath a bruised purple sky, David sat in the conference room with representatives from Delta Western. Robert Ellis was there, along with 2 executives and Dana Reeves from the FAA's Ethics Division. The atmosphere was professional, but tense. No one wanted to admit fault outright, yet everyone knew change was non-negotiable. David began the meeting with the same calm that had carried him through the crisis. "We can't fix bias with training slides," he said. "We need transparency. Real metrics. Passengers should be able to report incidents directly, without fear of being ignored. Every crew member should know their behavior is visible." One of the executives shifted in his chair. "Visible how recorded?" David said simply, "Not by cameras and faces, but by accountability and systems. Pattern recognition. Repeated complaints flagged in real time. An ethics network not for punishment, but for prevention." Dana nodded. "We've seen success with similar frameworks in other agencies. It's feasible." Ellis looked impressed. "And you're offering EtherTech's system to manage it." David leaned forward. "I'm offering to build it. Open source, transparent, auditable by third parties. Call it the Sky Code Initiative." The room went silent. Ellis finally said, "You're turning a scandal into reform." David's gaze didn't waver. "No," he said quietly. "I'm turning a moment of blindness into a future of sight." The meeting continued for another hour. By the end, contracts were drafted, committees assigned, and the first phase of Sky Code scheduled to begin within 90 days. When David stepped out into the rain again, he didn't feel triumphant. He just felt ready. At home that night, Amara sat cross-legged on the living room rug, watching the local news on mute. A segment flashed across the screen. EtherTech CEO and Delta Western announced joint anti-bias program. Her father's image appeared briefly, standing beside airline executives, expression calm but resolute. She turned down the volume completely and looked over at him as he walked into the room. "They're calling you the man who grounded prejudice," she said with a small smirk. He chuckled. "That's dramatic. Is it true?" He sat beside her on the couch. "I didn't ground prejudice, sweetheart. I just stopped pretending it flies unnoticed." She leaned against him. "That's better." The rain began again outside, soft against the windows. They sat there for a long while without speaking, watching the lights of the city shimmer through the glass. Before bed, Amara opened her notebook again. She wrote one line, slow and deliberate. "Sometimes change doesn't start with fire. It starts with rain." Downstairs, David looked out into the dark, his reflection merging with the skyline. He thought of Carol Mason, who had written him a letter of apology that morning. She'd said she was starting volunteer work with youth outreach, teaching kids about empathy and awareness. He'd read it twice, not for closure, but for understanding. Maybe that was the ripple when one person's awakening stirred another's. He turned off the light and whispered to the empty room, "Let it keep moving." Outside, the city glowed still wet, still alive, still listening. By the time the third week arrived, the world had moved on, or at least it looked that way from the outside. News cycles spun faster now, swallowing yesterday's outrage before the coffee cooled. But some stories refused to fade quietly, and the story of Amara Lewis was one of them. Not because of spectacle, but because of stillness. It had lingered in the public mind like a melody that wouldn't leave. Amara didn't understand the full weight of it at first. Her face appeared on morning talk shows, on blogs about resilience, even in a short documentary about modern discrimination. People called her the girl who stayed calm. She never watched any of them. She said she didn't need to see herself to remember what happened. The memory had already settled into her bones. One Wednesday afternoon, her English teacher, Mrs. Collins, approached her after class. "We're doing a special assembly next month," she said. "It's about dignity and courage. Would you consider speaking?" Amara hesitated. "I'm not really a speaker, Mrs." Collins smiled. "You weren't trying to be one the last time either, but people listened anyway." That night, she told her father about it over dinner. The table between them was scattered with papers, his Sky Code project drafts, her half-finished essay. The smell of roasted salmon filled the kitchen. "Do you think I should?" she asked. David looked up from his notes. "Only if it helps you heal, not if it helps them feel better." She nodded, chewing the thought carefully. "I don't want to make it about blame." "Then make it about truth," he said softly. "Truth has its own gravity." Over the next few days, Amara worked on her speech in secret. She wrote late at night, the house quiet except for the soft ticking of the hallway clock. She didn't write about the humiliation or the viral moment. She wrote about the silence between them the moment she realized she didn't have to raise her voice to prove she mattered. While Amara was writing, David was flying to Washington, D.C. to present Sky Code before the Civil Aviation Ethics Board. The meeting was tense but promising. He stood before a semicircle of officials, his voice steady, his presentation clear. "This isn't just about airlines," he said. "It's about systems that decide who is seen and who is doubted. Technology can't erase bias, but it can illuminate it. And once you see bias clearly, you can no longer pretend it's invisible." After he spoke, The room stayed quiet for several seconds. Then the chairwoman, a woman named Patricia Osei, leaned forward. "Mr. Lewis, are you proposing that ethical oversight becomes a federal compliance requirement?" "Yes," David said simply, "because dignity shouldn't depend on the gate you walk through." When he left the meeting, reporters were waiting outside. One called out, "Mr. Lewis, do you think this reform will actually change anything?" He paused before answering. "Change doesn't happen because of systems," he said. "It happens because of people who refuse to accept what's normal." The quote made the front page of several business outlets, but David didn't notice. He was already on a flight home, reviewing plans, his mind circling the same thought if change didn't outlive attention. It wasn't change at all. Back in Seattle, Amara's speech began to take shape. The night before the assembly, she sat by her window, listening to the faint hum of the city. Her notebook lay open on her lap, filled with revisions and scribbles. She could hear her father's soft typing downstairs, the steady rhythm that had always been her lullaby. When she closed her eyes, she saw the faces from that morning on the plane. Carol Mason's sharp disbelief, Lena's quiet kindness, Rachel's steady defiance. They lived in her memory like moving photographs. And she realized something she hadn't before: she wasn't the only one who'd stood up that day. Others had too, in their own ways. The next morning, the school auditorium was packed. Teachers lined the walls. Students shuffled in their seats, whispering. Amara waited backstage, clutching her notebook so tightly her knuckles turned pale. She'd faced adults with power and authority, but this sea of classmates felt different. When Mrs. E. Collins introduced her, the applause was hesitant but warm. Amara stepped up to the podium, the microphone amplifying her soft breath. She looked down at her notes, then up at the crowd. "My name is Amara Lewis," she began. "A few weeks ago, I was told I didn't belong in a seat that had my name on it. I didn't shout, I didn't argue, I waited. And while I was waiting, I learned something." The auditorium quieted. "I learned the silence can be heavy, but it can also be strong. I learned that dignity isn't given, it's claimed. And I learned that sometimes, when people doubt your worth, it's not your job to convince them. It's your job to remember it." She paused, eyes sweeping the crowd. "I'm not angry anymore, but I am awake. And I hope all of you, when someone tries to make you small, remember that standing still isn't weakness. It's power that doesn't need permission." When she finished, the silence lasted longer than she expected. Then came applause, slow at first, then thunderous, echoing through the hall like rain on glass. David was standing at the back of the room, having arrived quietly just before she began. He didn't clap right away. He just watched, pride swelling in his chest. Not because of her words, but because of the calm in her voice, the calm she'd earned. After the assembly, Mrs. Collins approached him. "She's remarkable," she said. "She always has been," he replied. As they walked to the car later, Amara said, "You didn't tell me you were coming. I didn't want to make you nervous." She smiled. "You would have made me stronger." They drove in comfortable silence for a while. Then David said, "They asked me to testify next month before the Senate Subcommittee on Aviation Ethics." "Really?" He nodded. "Skycode's getting national attention. They want to make it a federal model." "That's huge," she said. "It's a beginning," he corrected gently. "The rest depends on how people carry it forward." That evening, as the sun melted behind the skyline, Amara sat on the porch with her father. She had her notebook open again, sketching the faint outline of a wing. "Do you think people ever stop doubting each other?" she asked quietly. David leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "Maybe not," he said. "But maybe the goal isn't to stop doubt, it's to meet it with truth every single time." The porch light flickered on. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and then faded. The night smelled like wet cedar and promise. David's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Carol Mason. She had attached a photo, her standing beside a group of high school students in a workshop titled Empathy in the Air. Her message was short. "We're trying. Thank you for not giving up on us." He showed the photo to Amara. She looked at it for a long time, then whispered, "Maybe she's flying again, just in a different way." He nodded. "Maybe we all are." Later, when Amara went to bed, she placed her notebook on her nightstand. The last line she'd written glowed faintly under the lamplight. "Change doesn't shout, it lingers." Downstairs, David sat by his laptop, finalizing his Senate testimony draft. He reread the opening line twice before saving it. This isn't a story about anger. It's a story about recognition, about how we see each other and what happens when we finally decide to look. He closed the file, turned off the light, and stood by the window. Outside, a plane rose into the night sky, its lights blinking against the clouds. For the first time in weeks, he didn't flinch at the sound of engines. He just watched as it climbed higher, steady and sure. The day of the Senate hearing arrived under a pale morning light. Washington, D.C., hummed with its usual rhythm, traffic lights blinking, aides hurrying across marble steps, reporters waiting like sentinels with microphones and steady smiles. Inside the Capitol, the air carried the faint tang of coffee, paper, and anticipation. David Lewis adjusted his tie in the reflection of a bronze elevator door. He wasn't nervous, not exactly. He'd spoken before countless investors, government boards, and CEOs. But this was different. This was personal, dressed as professional. Pain translated into policy. As he waited outside the hearing room, he thought of Amara, sitting in her Seattle classroom right now, probably pretending not to check her phone every 5 minutes. He smiled at the thought. Marcus appeared beside him, holding a folder. "Here's the final brief," he said quietly. "Sky Code Summary. Projected Impact. FOA Partnership Letters." David took it, flipping through the pages with practiced calm. "You didn't have to come all this way." "Marcus, wouldn't miss it," Marcus said, lowering his voice. "Besides, someone's got to make sure you eat after this thing." The door opened. An aide gestured toward David. "Miss Lewis, they're ready for you. Inside." The room was wide and bright, wood-paneled and severe. Senators sat in a semicircle, nameplates glinting beneath the lights. Cameras lined the back wall. David took his seat at the witness table, his prepared remarks neatly stacked before him. Patricia Ossie, now the Ethics Board Chair, gave him a reassuring nod from the first row. Senator Harrison, tall and composed, leaned forward. "Miss Lewis, thank you for joining us today. We've reviewed your proposal Sky Code. Before we proceed, I'd like to ask what inspired you to take this public." David folded his hands, his voice even, "because silence doesn't fix systems. Senator, I've spent my career building technology meant to make air travel safer, but after what happened to my daughter, I realized safety isn't only about physics, it's about dignity. A flight isn't secure when someone's humanity can be dismissed at 30,000 feet. The room grew still. The senator nodded slowly, powerful words. But some critics claim your initiative could invade employee privacy. How do you respond to that Sky Code doesn't monitor people? David replied. It monitors patterns, behavioral data, verified reports, and feedback loops that flag inequity before it escalates. It's not about catching villains. It's about preventing harm. Another senator, Alvarez, interjected. You're suggesting a complete shift in airline accountability. I'm suggesting transparency, David said simply. A world where bias can't hide behind bureaucracy. For nearly an hour, the questioning continued. David answered each one with quiet clarity, his tone unwavering. Every sentence carried both technical precision and moral weight. By the end, even the skeptical senators seemed thoughtful. When it was over, Chairwoman Osei stood, Mr. Lewis, on behalf of the board and the committee. Thank you. Sky Code will move to implementation review within the month. The applause was polite, restrained, but underneath it, something was shifting. For the first time in years, the committee chamber felt less like a courtroom and more like a place where progress might actually breathe. Afterward, in the corridor, reporters surrounded him. Mr. Lewis, do you believe this law will change behavior on a systemic level? One shouted. David stopped, met her gaze, and said, It will if people remember that every system starts as a story. We can choose how it ends. That quote ran everywhere within hours. Back in Seattle, Amara watched the coverage during lunch break. Her friends gathered around her phone, their faces glowing under the cafeteria lights. One of them whispered, Your dad just changed aviation. Amara smiled shyly. He just helped people look up differently. That night, when David returned home, exhaustion clung to him like fog. Amara met him at the door, hugging him tightly. You looked calm on TV, she said. Was I? He laughed. Because I couldn't feel my legs. She laughed too. You were amazing. He hung up his coat and loosened his tie. You know, he said, you're the reason all this exists. I didn't do anything, she replied. He smiled softly. You stayed steady when the world tilted. That's everything. They sat down to dinner, just the two of them. The conversation drifted from politics to ordinary things, her school project, his late meetings, a new coffee blend Marcus had introduced him to. For a moment, life felt normal again. But that night, long after Amara had gone to bed, David stood by his office window, staring out at the city lights reflecting off the sound. He felt the weight of what he'd started. Change always looked simple from afar, but up close, it was slow, uneven, demanding. He wondered how many people would resist it, how many would twist its meaning, how many would quietly hope it failed. He almost didn't hear the knock at his door. It was Lena Ortiz, smiling softly, holding a thin folder. I thought you'd still be awake, she said. He gestured for her to come in. You flew in late flight? Fitting. Right. She handed him the folder. It's the first curriculum for our empathy training. We're calling it The View from Seat 2C. Thought you might like to look it over. He opened it carefully. Inside were lesson outlines, testimonials, and one printed quote in large, clean font. Sometimes the smallest act of stillness changes the whole sky. Amara wrote that, Lena said quietly. David looked up, eyes soft. Of course she did. Lena sat down across from him. You realize she's changed more people than either of us ever will. Right. He nodded slowly. That's what scares me and gives me hope. They talked long into the night, about reform, about compassion, about how progress was less about winning and more about listening. When Lena finally left, David sat alone for a long while, the faint hum of the city rising through the window. The next morning, the first headlines appeared: Senate backs Sky Code ethics. Bill dignity is a right, not a request. Messages poured in from around the world: pilots, attendants, parents, even school teachers thanking him, questioning him, challenging him. David responded to as many as he could, but one email stopped him cold. It was from Carol Mason. Her message read, "I watched your testimony. I cried the whole time. I used to think fairness was the absence of hate. Now I know it's the presence of awareness. Thank you for not letting me stay blind." He read it twice, then forwarded it to Lena with one line, "This is why we keep going." Later that evening, he and Amara went for a walk along the waterfront. The sun had dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and violet. Children played near the docks, their laughter ringing through the air. Amara turned to him. "Do you think people really change, or do they just learn to hide it better?" He thought about it for a moment. "I think the ones who really listen, change becomes their second language." She nodded, satisfied. "Then we should keep speaking it." He laughed quietly. "Deal." They stood there for a long time, the waves catching the last light of day. The world hadn't transformed overnight, but something deep within it had shifted. Subtle but irreversible. As they turned to leave, Amara looked back at the horizon. The water was calm now. The sky stretched wide and forgiving. "Dad," she said softly, "it's funny. What is the higher the plane goes, the smaller the people look, but the smaller you feel, the bigger the truth becomes." He smiled at her words, realizing how much she'd grown. "You should write that down." "I already did," she said, holding up her notebook. And somewhere between them, the man who built systems and the girl who built meaning, the sky no longer felt heavy. It felt open, endless, like something worth protecting. A year had passed since that morning on Flight 217, but to Amara Lewis, it still felt close enough to touch. The memory had softened, not vanished. It had become something she carried lightly, like a lesson folded into her heart. Her life had changed in quiet ways. People recognized her sometimes, mostly strangers who smiled and said, "You're that girl from the video." She would smile back politely, never sure what to say. To her, she wasn't that girl. She was just Amara, still writing in her notebook, still curious, still learning what it meant to belong. Seattle had moved into early spring. The cherry blossoms near their home had burst open overnight, scattering petals like confetti across the sidewalks. David Lewis stood by the kitchen counter, pouring coffee into a mug, his laptop open beside him. The Sky Code initiative had become a global benchmark adopted not only by American Airlines, but by carriers in Europe and Asia. Training programs, ethics networks, real-time monitoring, all born from a moment that started with silence and doubt. Yet success, David thought, wasn't something you could measure by numbers. It was measured by who felt seen. He looked out the window as Amara came downstairs, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She was taller now, her curls pulled into a neat bun. She carried herself differently, not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. "Big day today," he said. She nodded. "Yeah." "Mrs. Collins said the mayor's coming to the school assembly. We're presenting the Voices of Dignity project." David smiled. "You proud of yourself?" She shrugged, though a small smile tugged at her lips. "A little. You should be," he said. "You started this without even meaning to." She zipped her jacket. Sometimes things start when people stop pretending not to see. He paused, taken aback by her words. You sound like a philosopher. I sound like your daughter, she replied with a grin. Later that morning, the auditorium at her school buzzed with energy. Students moved in and out of rows, arranging posters and audio equipment. The stage backdrop read, "Dignity has no altitude." It had been Amara's suggestion. When she stepped up to test the microphone, a familiar figure walked in. Lena Ortiz, carrying a sleek case. "You made it," Amara said, beaming. "Wouldn't miss it." Lena replied, "Captain Carter sends her love. She's flying to Toronto today, fittin'." "Right," Amara laughed. "Always in the air." Lena opened her case, revealing a small model aircraft engraved with the words Seat 2C Legacy Award. "For you," she said softly. Amara blinked. "Is this real?" Lena nodded. "It's the first of its kind. The Empathy in Aviation Foundation started it to honor people who remind us why flight matters not just as travel, but as connection. You inspired it." Amara touched the model's silver wing, her reflection glimmering in its surface. "It's beautiful." "So are you, kid," Lena said. "Keep your compass true." When the assembly began, the room filled with applause, laughter, and the rustle of paper programs. The mayor gave a short speech about inclusion, followed by a local poet who recited a piece titled Runway of Hearts. But it was Amara's turn that quieted the room completely. She walked to the podium, the small model plane still in her hand. Her eyes swept the crowd, students, teachers, parents, even reporters. She took a slow breath. "When I was younger," she began, "I thought flying was about getting somewhere. Then one morning, I learned it's also about being seen where you already are." The audience leaned forward. People ask what happened that day on the flight. I tell them it wasn't just one person's mistake. It was a mirror showing us how we look at each other. But I also tell them something else: mirrors can change what they reflect if light hits them differently. She smiled faintly. "That's what Sky Code did. That's what my dad did. That's what we can all do. Change the angle of the light." A quiet murmur of emotion rippled through the room. "I don't want to be remembered as the girl who was denied a seat," she said, her voice steady. "I want to be remembered as someone who made room for conversation, for compassion, for courage." Applause rose like thunder. In the front row, David sat still for a moment, eyes glassy, before clapping. He wasn't the kind of man who cried easily, but pride had its own weight, and it filled every corner of him. After the event, reporters approached them both for interviews, but Amara declined politely. "Today isn't about what happened," she said. "It's about what we do next." Later that evening, as the sky turned lavender over Puget Sound, David and Amara sat on a park bench overlooking the water. The wind smelled faintly of salt and spring. Families strolled by. A dog chased a ball down the hill. Life, ordinary and beautiful, moved quietly around them. David took a sip of coffee. "Do you remember what you said that morning on the plane?" Amara frowned, thinking, "Which part?" "When you told Carol she didn't have to call me sir. You told her she could just mean it." Amara smiled faintly. "Yeah, I didn't plan that. It just came out." He nodded. "That line changed more than you know." They sat in silence for a while, watching the light fade. Then Amara turned to him. "What happens now?" David looked out at the horizon. "Now," he said softly, "we build a world where stories like ours are no longer remarkable." Amara nodded. "A world where first class isn't about where you sit, but how you treat people. That's my girl, he said, his voice thick with pride. A few feet away, a small boy pointed at a plane taking off. Look, Mommy, it's going into the clouds, he shouted. His mother smiled and said, That's where dreams go to practice. Amara and David both smiled at the sound. As the last light slipped behind the mountains, Amara pulled her notebook from her backpack. Can I read you something? David leaned back. Always. She opened to a page near the end. It's called The Sky Belongs to Everyone. Her voice was soft but strong as she read, Once, I thought the sky was just a place above us. Now I know it's everything between us, the air we share, the silence that carries truth, the distance that reminds us to reach. Every flight, every face, every small act of courage, they belong to the same sky. And that means we belong to each other. When she finished, David didn't speak right away. The world seemed to have paused around them, the wind gentler, the water quieter, even the city lights blinking slower. Finally, he said, You're going to change the world. You know, she smiled, closing the notebook. Maybe, but I'm starting with the sky. He laughed softly. Fair enough. As they walked home, the first stars began to appear small, steady, countless. Amara looked up, her hand tucked into her father's. For the first time since that morning on the plane, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not because the world had changed completely, but because she had helped it start to. And somewhere in the vastness above, a jet passed silently across the night, its lights blinking like a promise. The sky, after all, had never belonged to one kind of person. It had always belonged to everyone who dared to look up and believe. The story of Amara and her father isn't just about racism, it's about recognition. It reminds us that dignity isn't a luxury, it's a right. What happened on that flight shows how injustice often hides in plain sight, disguised as procedure, policy, or misunderstanding. But when one person chooses calm over chaos, truth over pride, the ripple can reach farther than anger ever could. For older generations, this story carries a deeper echo. It reminds us of every time we've seen unfairness and wondered whether to speak or stay silent. The lesson isn't only for the young, it's for all of us to use our influence, our experience, our compassion, to shape a world where respect isn't requested, it's reflexive. David Lewis didn't fight with volume. He fought with integrity. Amara didn't demand a seat, she embodied belonging. And maybe that's what justice really is: not revenge, but restoration. In the quiet strength of that father and daughter, we see what it means to rise above humiliation and to teach the world how to do the same. Thank you for joining us in this journey through courage, dignity, and quiet strength. Stories like Amara's remind us that change often begins in the smallest moments, when we choose empathy over ego and action over anger. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories that heal, challenge, and inspire. Because sometimes, the most powerful voices aren't the ones that shout, they're the ones that stay calm and keep flying.